As the U.S. government is stepping up its airstrikes against very limited targets in Syria and Iraq, against ISIS, Islamic State, ISIL, whatever it is you want to call them, Secretary of State John Kerry is using his bully pulpit to call upon moderate Muslims to change the narrative. Now, you've probably noticed that a lot of the media in America, both print, television, and online, are referring to these terrorists as Islamic State. And there are now Muslim groups and some Muslim nations that are saying, please don't call them the Islamic State because it's giving Islam a bad name. So John Kerry is saying, well then, moderate Muslims, seize the narrative. Take over the narrative. If you want to give us a better impression of Islam, and you want us to believe that you are peaceful and that you want to get along with non-Muslim nations and that you want to protect the human rights of non-Muslims that live within your borders, then grab the narrative and talk to us. Well, here's the problem. If I could just get you to think about Islam here and Christianity here, let me make my point. Islam has a historic narrative. In other words, we know that Muhammad lived, we know that he was a figure in history, and there is a very extensive record of his life, his words, his deeds, not in the Quran so much, but in what are called the Hadith and the traditions of the Prophet and the canonical biographies that exist of him. So if you're a Muslim and you want to follow the Muslim narrative, where do you go? You go to the life of Muhammad. You go to his early companions. You go to his first successors or caliphs. Caliph is an Arabic word that simply means successor. And the caliphate, or the caliphate, depending on how you hear it pronounced, is the office of the successors of Muhammad, the spiritual, political, and military leader of the Ummah, the Islamic nation, the Islamic State, okay? If you want to understand Christ, if you want to follow the Christian narrative, you go where? You go to the four Gospels, and then you would go to the book of Acts to see what his early apostles did, what his early disciples did. And if you were really an aggressive student of early church history, you'd look at the first 100, 200, 300 years. But primarily you'd go to the Gospels and to the book of Acts. That's the narrative. That's where we learn about Jesus, what he did, what he said, what his early apostles did. It's there that we see the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, the call of Christ to his followers to take up their cross, to die to themselves. That's the narrative that was left to us. Now, if somebody said, we want you moderate Christians to seize the narrative, what does that even mean? In other words, the narrative of Christ's life and the apostles, it's there. We either embrace it or we reject it, but we can't change it. Well, it's the same thing for Muslims, all right? The narrative of Muhammad walking into his daughter, Fatima, and saying, wash the blood from my sword, daughter, for it has served me well this day. The narrative of Muhammad overseeing the decapitation of hundreds and hundreds of elderly men, middle-aged men, men in their 20s and 30s, teenage boys, cutting off their heads, pushing their bodies into the ditches that they dug in Medina and then burying them in mass graves. That narrative is there. How do you change that narrative? Do they say, well, we think what Muhammad did is bad? Then why are you a Muslim? Well, we don't agree with what Muhammad did. Well, it's not for you to decide. That's the problem. Now, I'm going to take a break. When we come back, I want to further discuss what's happening with America and ISIL or ISIS or the Islamic State, whatever you want to talk about. We're going to talk about Eric Holder, and we're going to talk about you and me and maybe getting what we deserve. That makes me shudder. I'll be right back.